Hello, welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. And in this episode, we do Korea, both North and South, from 1950 to the present. So what happened to Korea? It was divided between the United States and the USSR after the Second World War. It was plundered by Japan from, as we talked about, the takeover in really starting in the 1890s, but definitely after 1905. And during the Second World War, it was completely plundered. And there was no national government to take over. It had been completely wiped out by Japan and colonized by Japan. Remember, you couldn't even use the Korean language. So Korea in 1945 is starting from all over. Despite being 5,000 years old, a lot of the institutions that we've talked about from 1500 to 1900 no longer existed. So in 1946, the Soviet Union sets up a communist government under Kim Il-sung, and that becomes the People's Republic of Korea. Obviously, I say this obviously, but we know this government is going to be allied to the Soviet Union, of course, but also to Mao's government in China, to the Communist Party, to the CCP in China. Why? Well, because Northern Korea has always been allied to China, right? I mean, the Korean Peninsula has traditionally been an ally of China. We've talked about this over and over. But the closer you are to the Yalu River, the border, the more influence from China you've had. And we've done this over and over. So it's not a surprise. So Kim Il-sung is the ally of the Soviet Union. And he's going to be an ally also of Mao's Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. In 1948, the United States allows elections in the South, and that's going to create the Republic of Korea. By 48, the Cold War is kind of starting. There's all kinds of arguments of when the Cold War starts, but by 48, it's clearly grinding to an event, but Europe is the bigger problem to deal with. So basically, both sides have their attention on Europe. There's going to be the Berlin airlift and the isolation of Berlin by Soviet forces, and the Berlin airlift to bring in food and supplies. There's going to be the Berlin Wall, which will eventually be built in the 60s. There's going to be U.S. interventions in Italy and France elections to make sure that communist parties don't win. The eye is on Europe. It's the bigger problem to deal with if you're in Moscow or in Washington, D.C. But going on in Korea, the moderates are starting to be assassinated. They're starting to be kicked out of politics. The unionists, the people who want there to be a unification of Korea, are getting assassinated because that's a compromise. So from 45 to 50, from 1945 to 1950, what we're seeing is the poles, polarization. The poles are pulling apart, and the center, which used to dominate the politics, is being pulled like slime, like silly putty, to be thinner and thinner and thinner. And those who have the best ability to bring the poles back to the middle are getting assassinated, which is, as we have talked about, a Japanese concept. Now, I'm not saying Japan is involved in the assassinations, but remember when we talked about Japan going into from 1915 to 1940, how you didn't just defeat your rival politicians at the polls, you also assassinated them or you assassinated them without defeating them at the polls. Remember, the Japanese got rid of Queen Min, right? They assassinated her. You assassinate your enemy. So the question is not if, but when and by whom there will be unification. Japan is defeated, so Korea cannot be part of Japan. The United States doesn't want to own it. The Soviet Union is too far away to own it, to absorb it. China has never absorbed it, has never owned it. So there has never been multiple countries on the peninsula. And that's not exactly true. There have been multiple kingdoms. But we've talked about one kingdom on the Korean Peninsula for so long, probably what 900 years at this point, that the question is just when and by whom. But it's not looking good in 1945, 1947, 1948. And that's when the Korean War begins, in 1950. North Korea invades, using a lot of Soviet surplus World War II equipment, and nearly wins. By the summer of 1950, the United States and South Korean military has been pushed back to one port, Busan, or Busan, depending on, I know it both ways. Busan. We've talked about it as Busan, but it's also referred to as Busan. And there's this, it's this beachhead, basically. Remember, the North is usually more powerful because it's closer to China. So Northern Korea usually absorbs Southern Korea. Southern Korea is where the Japanese or the French showed up, where invasions happen from, right? But the unification of Korea, whether it's the Mongols or the Ming or the Qin maintaining the governments, is always an invasion from the north into the south. And so this looks like a repeat. The summer of 1950 looks like a repeat of traditional Korean history. In September 1950, the U.S. invades. They build up a bulwark at Busan, and then a very daring attempt at a maneuver around the Korean Peninsula to drop off at Incheon an army. So basically to cut the North Korean supply lines. The army that's invading, that's besieging Busan, is now cut off with an American army behind it. What that means is you're going to run out of bullets, you're going to run out of fuel, you're going to run out of gasoline, so you got to get back to North Korea. You either got to defeat that American army, so you got to turn around. But at the moment you turn around, the army in Busan can attack you. So that creates a retreat. The North Korean army, which, let's face it, isn't very good in 1950, not compared to the American army or the Soviet army. Or the communist Chinese army. It's not very good, and it's not very good because it's been plundered for the last 50 years by Japan. Right? So it runs away. Makes total sense. They cut off the North Korean army. If you're North Korean, you want to get back to North Korea. Get back above that line before you get hammered between the hammer and the anvil. You are the nail between the hammer and the anvil of these two American armies. Meanwhile, you're being bombed from above. So you want to get back. What that does is completely disintegrate the North Korean army, and the Americans then invade North Korea and reach the Yalu River, the traditional border with China. It looks like South Korea is going to, with American help, is going to reunite Korea. That's what it looks like. Phnom Penh has been taken. There are American Marines at the Yalu River overlooking China. They could literally see China from where they are. But we have seen this before. And anyone who has studied Korean history would know this was going to happen. China invades. In November, December 1950, China invades. To protect China, and this is partly because MacArthur, the general at the time, wanted a global war on communism. He wanted to fight communists everywhere. He wanted to invade China. There's even arguments that he wanted to nuke China. This is kind of before, you have to realize, this is in 1949, the Russians created their atomic bomb, getting rid of the monopoly. But it's still, I don't think yet, the H-bomb has been invented, the hydrogen bomb. So we're still dealing with fission, not fusion. And so the idea was, you can bomb. You could use the atomic bomb and blow up cities, and it wouldn't be so bad. You could survive a nuclear war. It's the H-bomb that makes nuclear war. You cannot survive a nuclear war. Because you have to remember, the guys who blew up Nagasaki, right, had burned down Tokyo. It took them a little longer, but the result was the same. Tens of thousands of people were dead. There's an argument to be made that the nuclear bomb was actually nicer because you wiped people out in a second, rather than what the Tokyo firebombing was, where people burned to a crisp or suffocated on the heat. I mean, that's terrifying. And it's safer for Americans, would be the argument. And so before the invention of the hydrogen bomb, there's still kind of this idea that you can use nuclear weapons. It's not a big deal. It's just a bigger bomb. It accomplishes the same goal. So MacArthur is looking at an entire war in Asia against communists. And that means invading Beijing, remember the Boxer Rebellion? Or putting an American army back in China in the big cities, Shanghai, Nanjing, Beijing, and nuking the Communist Party. So, Communist China invades to protect China, to protect communism, and to protect Korea. Remember, we've seen this before. Every time a Korean government gets in trouble, it calls on its ally. There's 1,000 years of alliance. And every time, the Chinese government answers. The Ming, the Qing, they answer that call. And so 300,000 Chinese invade. Now, the Chinese Communist Party is not a good, the People's Liberation Army is not a good army in 1950. It could defeat Chiang Kai-shek, as we talked about, but it's not going to fight an American army unless it uses its one great advantage, which is numbers. It doesn't have the technology, but it's got the numbers. And in Korea, the Mao's guerrilla war that he used in China to fight Japan and then Chiang Kai-shek doesn't work. There's no room for it. There's no place to retreat. I mean, you could go back to China, but that defeats the purpose. So the Chinese army is going to take massive casualties. And they're just going to throw people and more people. The USA has the firepower, but China has the numbers. And in the end, the US has to is pushed back, has to fall back. So they end up at the 38th parallel, which was, more or less the border as it was then in 1950. It's more or less the 1945 border. It's not a straight border anymore. Now it follows a terrain more. And from 1951 to 1953, the next 2 years is a stalemate of these two groups slamming away at each other on the Korean Peninsula. Cooking in the summers, freezing to death in the winters, and a stalemate. But North Korea will survive. But interestingly, look at what happened. It went from a Soviet ally to a Chinese one. Now, in 1950, that's not the biggest of deals. By 1956, it will be. Because the CCP and the Soviet Union are going to break up. Their relationship is going to go bad. We've already talked about it in the China lectures. And so North Korea is going to end up as it has always ended up. As everyone who's a Korean expert would tell you it should end up. As an ally of China. So what are the results? One, the governments had to change to let the war end. Stalin dies, Eisenhower gets elected. Truman serves out his 2 terms, and Eisenhower is elected. And Eisenhower comes in saying, I'm going to nuke everybody if we don't have a peace treaty. He comes in with the original kind of madman concept. That you didn't know what he would do. Now, he wasn't going to nuke everybody, but it was a threat. It was like, let's make peace. And so, within a year, there's peace. The result is going to be 2 Koreas. Plus a communist China, a democratic Japan, and a democratic Taiwan. So this Korean War threatened to engulf everything. Because what would have happened if the Americans had been kicked off of the Korean Peninsula? Likely a Soviet-led, not Soviet person, but a Korean Chinese-led invasion of Japan to kick the Americans out of Japan. Or what if MacArthur got his way and the American invasion of North Korea had succeeded? They would have marched on Beijing, overthrown Mao, put in a democratic ally. Whether it's a full democratic government or not is a different story, but a democratic ally. It's also Taiwan will become democratic. It will be an American protectorate. The Americans now are going to protect Taiwan. And there's a fleet, even today, an American fleet separating mainland China, communist China, from Taiwan. The West makes new borders in the East. Japan, pro-American, democratic. Taiwan, pro-American, democratic. South Korea, pro-American, democratic. Mainland China will be communist, run by the CCP. North Korea will be communist, allied to China. 3, 200,000 Chinese are killed in the war. 200,000, 10 times what the Americans will lose. Western firepower is still superior. $20,000 communist Chinese defected to Taiwan. These are mostly prisoners of war, rather than go home. So there's the idea that Taiwan is, 1, Chinese, and 2, better. Now, Taiwan is not quite a democracy, and it won't be till the 1970s. 1980s, till Chiang Kai-shek dies. But it's an American ally. And so even the dictatorship in Taiwan is a nicer form of dictatorship. So South Korea will be the same way. These military dictatorships that are allied to the United States. But 20,000 communist Chinese defected Taiwan, showing that Taiwan is, one, Chinese, and two, is a better place to live. 4. Mao feels the Soviets will fight to the last Chinese. Remember, we started with North Korea was a Soviet ally. China, Mao's China, will throw 300,000 people at the original counter invasion to fight off the Americans. Soviets didn't throw people in, because if they threw Soviet troops in, it might cause a problem in Europe. So the Soviets are perfectly fine giving weapons, giving military advice, giving some money, but letting the Chinese fight it out. And yeah, it cost 200,000 people. So this is the beginning of the end of the Soviet Mao, Soviet CCP friendship. It's going to break. By 1956, it just breaks into the open, that the two just hate each other. 5. Taiwan is an ally of the United States. It will send troops. It will start industrializing just to help the USA. Chiang Kai-shek is back to being the USA ally. Remember, we talked about him. He was the man who lost China. Truman didn't like him. He was a failure. How did you lose? How could you be so corrupt? How could you mess this up? Well, now he's our man in Taiwan. We don't have to like him, but he's going to help us. And he knew where the bread was buttered. This was his opportunity to get back in. So Taiwan becomes a major trading partner of the United States. Top 10. By the time I was a kid, all of Apple's computers were made in Taiwan. My Atari was made in Taiwan. So a lot of the stuff that was made in China today was made in Taiwan then. And so it's Chiang Kai-shek is back to being a U.S. ally. He's a dictator. He's a military dictator, but he's a U.S. ally. He's dependable. And 6, the United States is now deep in Asian politics. And we're going to see this over and over and over again. The Cold War, the Korean War, of which is part of the Cold War, is going to drag the United States in. It wanted to be in Europe. It wanted to fix Europe. It didn't, okay, we'll rebuild Japan, but that's not a big deal. And now it's got to rebuild Japan, rebuild South Korea, help Taiwan, protect the Philippines. It's going to get involved in Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand. All of these places Europeans used to be, the United States is going to step in, worried that if it doesn't, Mao or the Soviet Union is going to step in into that vacuum and be the ally. Because none of these countries, as we'll talk about, are strong enough or rich enough or developed enough to be completely on their own. The Europeans made it that way so that they couldn't be independent. So now the U.S. is stepping in. And this is going to lead first to the Korean War and then a decade later to the Vietnam War. But also to dictatorships in the Philippines, in Indonesia, support for the Thai military dictatorships and coups, and Chiang Kai-shek and a South Korean, basically a South Korean military dictatorship as well. At least into the 1980s. That's when we'll start to see more democracy. All right, so let's talk about South Korea. Actually, we might as well break these up. So that's the Korean War. I'm going to break this up now, and we'll do South Korea, and then we'll do North Korea as separate lectures. So in our next episode, we're going to do South Korea from 1954 to 1988. So be safe, take care, be good.